A poor mechanic ran into a burning bus to save a young millionaire, and his life changed forever. The screams piercing through the morning air would haunt Marcus Rivera for the rest of his life, but not for the reasons anyone might expect. Marcus had been underneath Mrs. Patterson's old Buick when the world exploded into chaos just 50 feet from his small auto repair shop. The thunderous crash of metal against concrete made him roll out from under the vehicle, his weathered hands still clutching a wrench. What he saw made his heart stop. A city bus, its front end crumpled against a lamppost, smoke billowing from its engine in thick, ominous clouds that spoke of imminent disaster. Passengers poured from the emergency exits like water through a broken dam, some limping, others crying, all desperate to escape what everyone could sense was coming. Marcus dropped his tools and ran toward the wreckage, his work boots pounding against the asphalt. At 32, he had seen enough car accidents to know the signs. The particular smell of overheated metal, the way smoke changed color when electrical systems failed, the deadly silence before an engine fire turned into something much worse. The bus driver stumbled past him, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "Everyone's out," he gasped, clutching Marcus's oil-stained shirt. "Everyone's out, thank God." But as Marcus looked through the shattered windows, his trained eye caught something that made his blood freeze. In the very back of the bus, barely visible through the thickening smoke, a figure in bright pink remained motionless against a seat. While everyone else had fled to safety, someone was still inside, unconscious and completely unaware that death was creeping closer with every passing second. The flames were small now, just flickering orange tongues licking at the engine compartment, but Marcus knew better than most how quickly fire could consume metal and flesh. He had seen enough vehicle fires in his 15 years as a mechanic to understand the brutal mathematics of combustion. They had maybe 2 minutes before the entire bus became a tomb. Without a single thought for his own safety, without calculating odds or considering consequences, Marcus's body moved with the instinct of someone who had spent his entire life fixing things that were broken. He charged toward the bus, his lungs already burning from the acrid smoke that grew thicker with each step. The heat hit him like a physical wall as he reached the doors, but he pushed through, his mind focused on only one thing, the person in pink who needed him. Inside, the smoke was a living thing, clawing at his throat and making his eyes stream with tears. He stumbled through the debris-strewn aisle, past scattered purses and cell phones, following the splash of color that had caught his eye. When he reached her, his heart nearly stopped again, but this time for an entirely different reason. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost impossible, even unconscious and vulnerable. Her designer dress, tight and perfectly tailored, spoke of wealth that Marcus had only seen in magazines. Her dark hair cascaded over the seat like silk, and even in this moment of crisis, there was an elegance to her that made her seem untouchable. She was clearly from a world as far removed from his grease-stained reality as the stars were from the earth. But none of that mattered now. She was human, she was in danger, and she needed help. Marcus scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, despite her unconscious state. The contrast was stark, his calloused, oil-stained hands against her smooth, obviously expensive dress, his worn work clothes against her designer perfection. As he turned to carry her towards safety, the flames roared louder, as if protesting his rescue mission. The journey back through the smoke-filled bus felt like an eternity, compressed into seconds. His lungs screamed for clean air, his muscles strained under her weight, and the heat grew more intense with each step. But he never wavered, never stumbled, never considered setting her down to save himself. Something deep in his core, something that had nothing to do with heroics and everything to do with basic human decency, propelled him forward. When he finally burst through the bus doors and into the relatively clean air outside, the crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers and applause. But Marcus heard none of it. His entire focus was on the woman in his arms, checking for signs of life, feeling for the steady rhythm of her pulse against his wrist. She was alive, and in that moment, That was all that mattered in Marcus Rivera's world. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary heroes doing extraordinary things. Also, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love connecting with our amazing viewers around the world. As the paramedics worked over the unconscious woman, Marcus stood at a distance, his clothes singed and his face streaked with soot, watching as the bus he had just escaped became fully engulfed in flames. The explosion came exactly 93 seconds after he had carried her to safety. The windows blew outward in a shower of glass and metal, the heat so intense that everyone had to step back another 50 feet. Marcus felt his knees go weak as he realized just how close they had both come to being consumed by that inferno. If he had hesitated for even 30 more seconds, if he had stopped to think about the danger instead of acting on instinct, they would both be nothing but memories now. Detective Sarah Kim approached him as the fire department worked to contain the blaze. She was a small woman with kind eyes who had been first on the scene, and she needed his statement while the details were still fresh. Marcus found himself struggling to explain what had happened, not because he couldn't remember, but because the whole experience felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. "You didn't know her before today?" Detective Kim asked, glancing toward the ambulance where EMTs were preparing to transport the woman to Metropolitan General Hospital. Marcus shook his head. "Never seen her in my life. I saw she was still inside when everyone else had gotten out." He wiped soot from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving another dark streak across his face. Anyone would have done the same thing. But Detective Kim had been a cop for 12 years, and she knew that wasn't true. Most people, when faced with a burning vehicle and the very real possibility of death, would have waited for the professionals. They would have called 911 and hoped for the best. They certainly wouldn't have risked their lives for a complete stranger. The EMT who had been checking Marcus for smoke inhalation overheard their conversation. "You're lucky you got out when you did," he said, cleaning a small cut on Marcus's arm. "Another minute and you would have been in serious trouble. That was either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Marcus replied, his eyes still fixed on the ambulance. Through the open doors, he could see the woman, still unconscious but breathing steadily as the medical team prepared her for transport. Something about her peaceful expression, so serene despite everything that had just happened, made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, Marcus realized he didn't even know her name. He had held her life in his hands, had breathed in smoke and risked everything to save her, but she was still a complete mystery to him. The thought bothered him more than he expected it to. The crowd began to disperse as the excitement died down and the immediate danger passed. Marcus found himself the center of attention for several more minutes as neighbors and passers-by wanted to shake his hand, pat his back, and tell him what a hero he was. But the praise felt strange and uncomfortable. He kept insisting that he had only done what anyone would do, though deep down he was beginning to suspect that might not be entirely true. Mrs. Patterson, whose Buick he had been working on when everything started, appeared at his elbow with tears in her eyes. "Marcus, honey, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saved that girl's life. You're a real hero." But as Marcus looked around at the smoking wreckage, at the scorch marks on the pavement, at the pieces of debris scattered across the street, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had been in the right place at the right time and had simply done what needed to be done. The idea that his actions were somehow extraordinary seemed wrong to him, almost insulting to the basic human decency that he believed everyone possessed. The fire department captain, a weathered man named Rodriguez, who had seen his share of vehicle fires, pulled Marcus aside before he left. "I've been doing this for 22 years, he said, his voice serious. "I've seen a lot of brave people do a lot of stupid things, and I've seen a lot of smart people do nothing when action was needed. What you did today, that was something special. That bus went up like a Roman candle. If you hadn't acted when you did, that woman would be dead right now." The weight of those words settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. Someone was alive because of a decision he had made in a split second, without thought or calculation. The responsibility of that felt enormous and humbling at the same time. As he walked back to his shop, his legs still shaky from adrenaline, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the window of a neighboring business. He looked like he had been through a war. His face blackened with soot, his work shirt torn and singed, his hair disheveled from the heat and smoke. But his eyes held something new, something he had never seen there before. It was the look of a man who had discovered something important about himself, though he wasn't quite sure yet what that something was. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and visitors. Word of the rescue spread quickly through the neighborhood, and by evening, Marcus's small repair shop had received more attention than it had gotten in the entire previous year. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of those crucial minutes, only one thing occupied his thoughts, wondering if the woman in the pink dress was okay and hoping that somewhere across the city she was breathing easily and would wake up to see another day. At Metropolitan General Hospital, Isabella Roswell's world was reassembling itself one beeping monitor at a time. The daughter of real estate mogul Richard Roswell and socialite Catherine Montclair Roswell, Isabella had never experienced a moment in her 28 years when her life wasn't carefully orchestrated, meticulously planned, and executed with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Even her presence on that bus had been calculated, a publicity stunt designed by her father's PR team to show that the Roswell family understood and connected with ordinary working people. The irony was not lost on her as she drifted in and out of consciousness over the next 2 days. She, who had spent her entire adult life avoiding genuine human connection, had been saved by the most authentic act of human kindness she had ever encountered. Dr. Amanda Chen, the neurologist overseeing Isabella's care, explained to her parents that their daughter had suffered a concussion and severe smoke inhalation, but that she was expected to make a full recovery. The unconsciousness had been the brain's way of protecting itself from trauma, and now that the swelling had subsided, Isabella was beginning to emerge from her protective cocoon. Richard Roswell paced the private hospital room like a caged animal, his $1,000 shoes clicking against the polished floor. He was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, and his daughter's brush with death had left him feeling powerless and frustrated. "This is exactly why I told you that bus publicity stunt was a terrible idea," he muttered to his wife, who sat quietly beside Isabella's bed, holding their daughter's hand. Catherine Roswell was a different sort of creature entirely. Refined, elegant, and possessed of the kind of quiet strength that came from years of navigating high society politics. She had been beautiful once, stunningly so, and traces of that beauty still lingered in her carefully maintained features. But more than that, she had wisdom that her husband sometimes lacked, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to deeper truths. "Richard," she said softly, not taking her eyes off Isabella's peaceful face. "Our daughter is alive because a stranger risked his life to save her. Maybe instead of being angry about the circumstances, we should be grateful for the outcome." But Richard was not a man built for gratitude, especially when it involved acknowledging that someone from the working class had done something his money and influence could not have accomplished. The very idea that his daughter's life had been saved by a mechanic, a man who worked with his hands and probably made less in a year than Richard spent on a single business dinner, sat uncomfortably in his worldview. When Isabella finally opened her eyes on the second day, her first words were not about her condition or her comfort, but about something that surprised everyone in the room. "The man who saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke damage. "Is he okay? Was he hurt?" Dr. Chen consulted her chart. According to the paramedics' report, he was treated for minor smoke inhalation and released the same day. "He's fine." Isabella nodded, relief evident in her expression. For reasons she couldn't quite articulate, Knowing that her rescuer was safe felt more important than her own recovery. She had fragmented memories of being carried through smoke and heat, of strong arms that held her securely, of someone risking everything for a person he didn't even know. The experience had left her with questions that she couldn't shake, curiosities about the kind of person who would act so selflessly. Over the next few days, as Isabella's strength returned, she found herself thinking constantly about the rescue. She remembered almost nothing about the actual crash. The bus hitting the pole was a complete blank in her memory, but she had crystal-clear recollections of the aftermath. The smell of smoke, the sound of her rescuer's labored breathing, the feeling of being carried to safety by someone whose face she never saw, but whose presence had meant the difference between life and death. Her father brought newspapers and tablets loaded with news articles about the incident. The story had captured public attention in a way that surprised everyone. "Local mechanic saves heiress from burning bus," read one headline. "Hero in work clothes risks life for stranger," proclaimed another. There were photos of the burning bus, interviews with witnesses, and even speculation about whether Isabella would meet her rescuer to thank him personally. But it was a single photograph that captured Isabella's attention completely. Shot by a bystander with a cell phone camera, it showed a man in work clothes emerging from the smoke-filled bus with her unconscious form in his arms. His face was partially obscured by smoke and shadows, but something about his posture, the careful way he held her, the determination evident in every line of his body, made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with her medical condition. "I want to meet him," she told her parents on her 4th day in the hospital. Richard's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. We'll have the family attorney send him a check and a nice note. That's more than appropriate. Dad, he saved my life, and he'll be compensated for it, generously. But Isabella, you have to understand, people like that, they see opportunities in situations like this. Meeting with him would only encourage expectations that could become complicated." But Catherine studied her daughter's face with the keen eyes of a woman who had spent years reading people and situations. She saw something in Isabella's expression that worried and intrigued her in equal measure. It was a look she had never seen before, a kind of awakening, as if her daughter was discovering feelings and desires that had been dormant her entire life. "Perhaps," Catherine said carefully, "a brief meeting would be appropriate, just to say thank you. It would be the proper thing to do." Isabella smiled for the first time since the accident, and in that smile, Catherine glimpsed a version of her daughter she had never met before. Someone capable of genuine emotion, real connection, and authentic feeling. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Marcus Rivera had never owned a suit in his 32 years of life, and he saw no reason to start now. When the phone call came 3 days after the accident, he almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and he was elbow-deep in the engine of a 1987 Ford pickup that had been giving its owner trouble for months. But something made him wipe his hands on his coveralls and pick up on the 4th ring. The voice on the other end was polished, professional, and completely out of place in his small repair shop. "Mr. Rivera, this is Catherine Roswell. I believe you saved my daughter's life." Marcus nearly dropped the phone. In the 72 hours since the accident, he had tried not to think too much about the woman he had pulled from the bus. He had seen the news coverage, had learned that she was Isabella Roswell, daughter of one of the city's wealthiest families, but somehow that information had made her seem even more distant and unreal than she had been as an anonymous accident victim. Is your daughter okay?" was the first thing he managed to say. "She's going to make a full recovery thanks to you." There was genuine warmth in Catherine's voice that surprised Marcus. He had expected something colder, more formal. "She very much wants to meet you, to thank you in person. Would you be willing to come to the hospital this evening?" Marcus looked around his shop, at the oil stains on the concrete floor, at his tool chest with its dented drawers and fading paint, at the stack of invoices on his cluttered desk. The distance between his world and Isabella Roswell's seemed as vast as the space between planets. I don't I mean, is that really necessary? I'm just glad she's all right. Mr. Rivera, my daughter nearly died. You risked your life to save hers. The very least we can do is look you in the eye and say thank you. Something in Catherine's tone told Marcus that this wasn't really a request. He agreed to come by at 7 o'clock, then spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of nervous energy that he couldn't quite explain. He found himself paying attention to things he had never cared about before: the grease under his fingernails, the permanent oil stains on his hands, the way his reflection looked in the small mirror above the shop's tiny bathroom sink. Meanwhile, across the city, Isabella was experiencing her own kind of preparation anxiety. She had been released from the hospital that morning and was recuperating in her childhood bedroom in the Roswell mansion, a palatial estate in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. But for the first time in her adult life, the luxury that surrounded her felt overwhelming rather than comforting. She stood in front of her walk-in closet, staring at racks of designer clothes that collectively cost more than most people made in a year, and felt completely lost. What did one wear to meet the person who had saved their life? What outfit was appropriate for thanking someone who had risked everything for a stranger? Her usual wardrobe consisted of carefully selected pieces designed to project power, sophistication, and untouchability. As the heir to the Roswell fortune and a successful businesswoman in her own right, Isabella had learned early that appearance was armor, that the right clothes could create distance and command respect. But now she found herself wanting something else entirely, something that would make her seem approachable, human, real. She settled on a simple blue dress, elegant but understated, and minimal jewelry. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Isabella was struck by how different she appeared without the elaborate styling and designer labels that usually defined her public image. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and somehow more authentic. Her mother appeared in the doorway, watching her daughter's careful preparations with interest. "You seem nervous," Catherine observed. "I've never thanked someone for saving my life before," Isabella replied, attempting levity. "I'm not sure what the protocol is." But Catherine saw through the joke to the deeper truth beneath. Her daughter was nervous in a way that had nothing to do with social protocol and everything to do with meeting someone who had affected her profoundly. Isabella had met presidents, movie stars, and royalty without batting an eye, but the prospect of facing a working-class mechanic had her completely unsettled. "Just be yourself," Catherine advised, though she wondered if Isabella even knew who that was anymore after years of carefully constructed public personas. As evening approached, both Marcus and Isabella found themselves thinking about the same questions. What did you say to someone who had held your life in their hands? How did you bridge the gap between two completely different worlds? And why did the prospect of this meeting feel like something much more significant than a simple expression of gratitude? Neither of them could have predicted that in just a few hours, a brief encounter in a hospital room would set in motion a chain of events that would transform both of their lives in ways they had never imagined possible. They were about to discover that sometimes the most profound connections happen between people who seem to have nothing in common except a shared moment when everything that really mattered was suddenly crystal clear. Marcus Rivera stood outside the imposing glass facade of Metropolitan General Hospital at exactly 7 o'clock, wearing his cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt he had bought 3 years earlier for his cousin's wedding. He had spent 20 minutes in the hospital parking garage, sitting in his 15-year-old truck and questioning whether this was a good idea. Everything about the situation felt surreal, from the marble floors and crystal chandeliers in the hospital lobby to the fact that he was about to meet someone whose family could probably buy and sell his entire neighborhood without thinking twice about it. The private wing where Isabella was staying looked more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility. The rooms had wood-paneled walls, original artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city. Marcus felt increasingly out of place with each step, his work boots echoing against polished floors that probably cost more per square foot than he made in a month. Catherine Roswell met him outside Isabella's room, and Marcus was surprised by her warmth and genuine gratitude. She was nothing like the Ice Queen socialite he had expected. Her handshake was firm, her smile was real, and when she looked at him, he saw actual tears in her eyes. "Mr. Rivera, I cannot adequately express how grateful we are for what you did," she said, her composed exterior cracking slightly. "Isabella is our only child. Without your courage..." Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise, just as he had on the day of the accident. "Anyone would have done the same thing, Mrs. Roswell. I'm just glad she's okay." But Catherine shook her head. "That's where you're wrong. Most people wouldn't have acted. Most people would have waited for someone else to handle it. You didn't hesitate, and because of that, my daughter is alive." When Catherine opened the door to Isabella's room, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. She was sitting by the window, afternoon sunlight streaming across her face, and she was even more beautiful than he had remembered from that brief, smoke-filled encounter. But it was more than just her physical appearance that struck him. There was something different about her than he had expected. Instead of the cold, entitled heiress he had imagined, she seemed almost fragile, uncertain, and surprisingly approachable. Isabella looked up when they entered, and the moment their eyes met, something extraordinary happened. It wasn't the dramatic, cinematic moment that movies had taught them to expect. Instead, it was quieter, deeper, a recognition that passed between them, as if each was seeing something in the other that no one else had ever noticed. "You must be Marcus," Isabella said, standing slowly. Her voice was softer than he had expected, still slightly hoarse from smoke inhalation, but warm with genuine feeling. "Yes, ma'am. I'm glad to see you're doing better." The formal politeness felt awkward and insufficient for what had passed between them, but neither knew how to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. They stood there for a moment, two people who had shared the most intimate of human experiences, life and death, but who were essentially strangers. "Please, sit down." Isabella gestured to a comfortable chair near her bed. "I've been wanting to thank you properly." As Marcus sat, he noticed the way she moved, carefully, still recovering from her injuries, but with an unconscious grace that spoke of years of good breeding and expensive education. Everything about her should have intimidated him, should have reinforced the vast social and economic distance between them. Instead, he found himself drawn to the vulnerability he glimpsed beneath her polished exterior. "You don't need to thank me," Marcus said, his hands clasped awkwardly in his lap. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Isabella's voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. "What you did was extraordinary. You risked your life for someone you didn't know, someone you had no reason to care about. That's not something anyone would do. That's something a very special person would do." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, but it was unlike any interaction either of them had ever experienced. Despite their different backgrounds, despite the obvious disparities in their life circumstances, they found themselves talking easily, naturally, as if they had known each other for years rather than minutes. Marcus told her about his work, about the satisfaction he found in fixing things that were broken, about the small community of neighbors and regular customers who made up his world. Isabella found herself fascinated by the simplicity and authenticity of his life, so different from her existence of board meetings, charity galas, and carefully orchestrated social interactions. In return, Isabella shared things she had never told anyone, about the loneliness that came with wealth, about the difficulty of knowing whether people liked her for herself or for her money, about the pressure of living up to expectations that seemed to grow heavier each year. Marcus listened, without judgment, without advice, just with the kind of genuine attention that Isabella hadn't experienced since childhood. When visiting hours ended and Marcus finally stood to leave, both felt the strange reluctance that comes when a meaningful conversation is interrupted too soon. There were more things to say, more questions to ask, more connections to explore. "I hope I'll see you again," Isabella said as he reached the door, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Marcus turned back, surprised by the hope he heard in her voice. "I'd like that," he replied, meaning it more than he had expected to. As Marcus walked back to his truck, his mind was spinning with thoughts and feelings he couldn't quite process. The woman he had met bore no resemblance to the entitled heiress he had imagined. Instead, she had been warm, genuine, and surprisingly down to earth. More than that, he had felt a connection with her that defied logic and social convention. Meanwhile, Isabella sat by her window long after Marcus had gone, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the darkness below. For the first time in her adult life, she had met someone who saw her as simply Isabella, not as the Roswell heiress or the businesswoman or any of the other roles she was expected to play. With Marcus, she had felt like herself, whoever that was, and the feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. Neither of them slept well that night, both replaying every word of their conversation, both wondering if the connection they had felt was real or simply a product of extraordinary circumstances. What they didn't yet realize was that they had just taken the first steps toward discovering that sometimes love arrives not with fanfare and drama, but quietly, unexpectedly, between two people brave enough to see past the surface to the truth that lies beneath. 3 days after their first meeting, Isabella Roswell did something she had never done in her 28 years of carefully orchestrated existence. She drove herself, alone and unannounced, to a working-class neighborhood to see a man her father would disapprove of completely. She had been thinking about Marcus constantly since leaving the hospital, replaying their conversation and remembering the way his presence had made her feel both safe and unsettled at the same time. There was something about his authenticity, his complete lack of pretense, that made her question everything about her own life. She had grown up surrounded by people who wanted something from her family: money, connections, social status. But Marcus had seemed genuinely uninterested in any of that. Isabella had spent hours researching him online, though she found surprisingly little information. Marcus Rivera, age 32, owned Rivera Auto Repair, a small shop in the Riverside district. He had no social media presence, no mention in society pages, no digital footprint beyond basic business listings. In a world where everyone seemed desperate for attention and recognition, his anonymity was refreshing and intriguing. The Riverside district was a 15-minute drive from Isabella's world, but it might as well have been on another planet. The streets were narrower, the buildings older and more weathered. Small businesses occupied storefronts that had seen better decades: a family-owned bakery, a coin-operated laundromat, a corner grocery store with hand-painted signs in the windows. It was authentic in a way that Isabella's carefully designed neighborhood could never be. Rivera Auto Repair occupied a modest space between a used bookstore and a restaurant that advertised the best tamales in the city. The building was old but well-maintained, with large bay doors that were rolled up to reveal Marcus working beneath the hood of a sedan. Isabella parked across the street and watched him for several minutes, struck by the focused concentration he brought to his work and the obvious skill with which he handled tools that looked like extensions of his own hands. When she finally gathered the courage to cross the street and approach the shop, Marcus looked up from the engine he was working on with surprise that quickly transformed into something warmer and more complex. He was wearing coveralls over a white t-shirt. His hands were stained with grease, and there was a smudge of motor oil across his left cheek. He had never looked more attractive to Isabella, though she couldn't have explained why. "Isabella," he said, wiping his hands on a rag and stepping toward her. "This is unexpected," she smiled, suddenly feeling nervous in a way that was completely foreign to her. "I was in the neighborhood," she lied, then immediately felt foolish. "Actually, that's not true. I wanted to see you again." The honesty in her admission caught them both off guard. Isabella had been trained from childhood to never reveal her true feelings or intentions, to maintain mystery and control in all social interactions. But something about Marcus made her want to skip the games and pretenses that had defined most of her relationships. Marcus gestured toward a small office area at the back of the shop. "Would you like to come in? I can make coffee, or there's a vending machine. Coffee sounds perfect." The office was tiny but organized, with a metal desk covered in invoices and repair orders, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a coffee maker that looked like it had been in service since the 1990s. Auto parts catalogs were stacked on every available surface, and the walls were covered with photographs of classic cars and handwritten thank you notes from satisfied customers. As Marcus busied himself with making coffee, Isabella studied the photographs with genuine interest. "You restored all of these?" "Most of them. Some were just major repairs, but a few were complete rebuilds." Pride was evident in his voice as he pointed to a 1967 Mustang in one of the photos. "That one took me 2 years working weekends and evenings. The owner's grandfather had left it to him in terrible condition, but it had sentimental value." Isabella found herself drawn to the obvious passion in Marcus's voice when he talked about his work. It was so different from the calculated enthusiasm she encountered in her business world, where every emotion seemed manufactured for effect. Marcus genuinely loved what he did, took real satisfaction in fixing things and helping people, and wasn't embarrassed to show it. They talked for over an hour, conversation flowing as easily as it had in the hospital. Marcus told her about growing up in this neighborhood, about learning to work on cars from his father, about the satisfaction of building something meaningful with his own hands. Isabella shared stories about her business education, about the loneliness of inherited wealth, about dreams she had abandoned because they didn't fit with family expectations. "What did you want to be when you were a child?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair and studying her face with genuine curiosity. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, thinking about dreams she hadn't examined in years. "A teacher," she finally admitted. "I wanted to work with children, maybe in underserved communities. I thought about the Peace Corps, about making a real difference in individual lives rather than just managing money and investments." "What stopped you?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Family pressure, social expectations, the weight of inheritance and responsibility, all of it had combined to steer her away from a path that might have brought genuine fulfillment. "Fear, I suppose," she said finally. "Fear of disappointing people, fear of not living up to expectations, fear of discovering I wasn't as capable as I thought I was." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. When I first took over the shop from my father, I was terrified I'd run it into the ground. But sometimes the scariest things are the most worthwhile." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a customer, an elderly woman whose car had been making strange noises. Isabella watched with fascination as Marcus interacted with Mrs. Garcia, treating her with the same respect and attention he might show a millionaire customer. There was no condescension, no impatience, just genuine care for solving her problem and making sure she felt safe driving her 20-year-old sedan. After Mrs. Garcia left with her car running smoothly and a promise that Marcus would check on it again in a few weeks, Isabella found herself seeing Marcus in an entirely new light. He wasn't just attractive and heroic. He was kind, skilled, and deeply connected to his community in a way that Isabella envied. "I should probably go," she said reluctantly as the afternoon wore on. "My family doesn't know I'm here, and they worry when I'm gone too long without explanation." Marcus walked her to her car, an expensive sedan that looked completely out of place on the working-class street. As she prepared to drive away, he leaned down to the window with an expression of uncertainty and hope. "Isabella, would you like to have dinner sometime? Somewhere neutral, where we can just talk?" The invitation was simple, but they both understood its significance. Accepting would mean acknowledging that whatever was growing between them was worth exploring, regardless of the complications it might create. "Yes," Isabella said without hesitation. "I would like that very much." As she drove away, both felt the exhilaration and terror of stepping into unknown territory. They were from different worlds, with different values and different life experiences, but they had found something rare and precious in each other: the possibility of genuine connection, authentic feeling, and love that transcended social boundaries. The question that neither dared ask out loud was whether their individual courage would be enough to overcome the obstacles that lay ahead. Their first official date was at a small Italian restaurant called Mama Benedetti's, tucked into a corner of the arts district where neither wealth nor working-class origins seemed to matter as much as good conversation and authentic food. Marcus had chosen the location carefully, wanting somewhere that wouldn't intimidate him with its formality, but wouldn't seem beneath Isabella's standards either. He arrived 20 minutes early, wearing the same button-down shirt from the hospital visit and a pair of dark jeans that he had bought specifically for this occasion. His nervousness was a living thing in his chest, making him second-guess every decision, from his choice of restaurant to his decision to pursue this impossible relationship at all. Isabella arrived exactly on time, and Marcus felt his breath catch when he saw her walking toward their table. She had chosen her outfit with the same care he had, a simple black dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, minimal jewelry, and an approachable smile that made her seem almost like a different person from the sophisticated heiress in the newspaper photos. "You look beautiful," Marcus said as he stood to greet her, the words slipping out before his nervousness could stop them. "Thank you," Isabella replied, genuinely pleased by the compliment. "You clean up pretty well yourself." The restaurant was perfect for their purposes, intimate enough for private conversation, but casual enough that neither felt out of place. The walls were covered with family photographs and amateur paintings by local artists. The menu was handwritten on a chalkboard, and the owner, an elderly Italian woman named Sophia, treated every customer like family. As they shared appetizers and talked about everything from books to travel to childhood memories, both began to relax into the possibility that this connection between them was real and worth exploring. Isabella found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn to Marcus's dry sense of humor and his ability to find joy in simple things. Marcus was continually surprised by Isabella's intelligence and warmth, so different from the cold socialite he had expected. "Tell me about the worst car you ever had to fix," Isabella said over their main courses, genuinely interested in hearing about his work. Marcus grinned, launching into a story about a vintage Volkswagen that had been modified so many times by previous owners that it barely resembled the original vehicle. As he talked, his hands moved expressively, and his eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Isabella found herself fascinated not just by the story, but by the passion Marcus brought to his craft. "Your turn," Marcus said when he finished. "Tell me about the most challenging business deal you've ever worked on." Isabella hesitated, unused to discussing her professional life with someone who wasn't trying to gain something from the conversation. But Marcus's genuine interest encouraged her to open up about a recent project involving affordable housing development, work that had meaning beyond profit margins, but that her father's company had ultimately abandoned for more lucrative ventures. "I wanted to make it work," she admitted. "The community needed those homes, and we could have done it profitably if we'd been willing to accept smaller margins. But the board voted to pursue a luxury development instead." Marcus heard the disappointment in her voice, the frustration of someone whose values were often at odds with family expectations. "That must have been difficult," he said simply. The conversation continued long after their plates were cleared, neither wanting the evening to end. They talked about their fears, their dreams, their experiences with family pressure and social expectations. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they discovered surprising commonalities. Both valued authenticity over appearance, both struggled with living up to other people's expectations, both felt somewhat isolated in their respective worlds. When Sophia finally approached their table with an apologetic smile, they realized they were the last customers in the restaurant. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said in accented English, "but we close soon." Outside on the sidewalk, neither wanted to say goodbye. The evening had been revelatory for both, proof that the connection they felt wasn't just gratitude or fascination with the unfamiliar, but genuine compatibility and attraction. "Would you like to walk for a while?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the nearby park, where streetlights created pools of warm light along winding paths. As they strolled through the quiet park, their conversation became more personal, more intimate. Isabella found herself sharing fears and insecurities she had never voiced to anyone. Marcus talked about his dreams of expanding his business, maybe teaching automotive skills to young people in the community, dreams that seemed modest compared to Isabella's world, but were no less meaningful. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Isabella said, as they finally reached her car. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself this much." "I was thinking the same thing," Marcus replied, then took a breath and gathered his courage. "Isabella, I know this is complicated. We come from very different worlds, and there are probably 100 reasons why this doesn't make sense, but I'd like to see you again." Isabella stepped closer to him, her heart racing with a combination of excitement and terror. Everything logical told her that pursuing this relationship was a mistake. Her family would object, society would judge, and the practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. But standing there in the soft glow of streetlights, looking into Marcus's honest, caring eyes, all of those concerns seemed less important than the simple truth that she had never felt this connected to another person. "I'd like that too," she said softly. "Very much." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and promise. Without overthinking it, Marcus reached up to gently touch her face, and Isabella leaned into the contact. Their first kiss was tentative, careful, a question asked and answered in the space of heartbeats. When they separated, both were smiling with the wonder of discovery. "Good night, Isabella," Marcus said, his voice warm with affection and promise. "Good night, Marcus." As Isabella drove home through the empty city streets, she felt like she was floating. For the first time in her adult life, she had connected with someone who saw her for who she really was, not what she represented or what she could provide. The feeling was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Marcus walked home with his hands in his pockets and a smile he couldn't suppress. He had taken a chance on something that seemed impossible, and instead of the rejection or awkwardness he had feared, he had found something beautiful and real. Whatever challenges lay ahead, tonight had proven that some connections transcended social boundaries and economic differences. Neither could have predicted that within 48 hours, their carefully protected secret would be front-page news across the city, forcing them to confront the reality that their private feelings had become public property, and that the obstacles to their relationship were more formidable than either had imagined. The photograph appeared on the front page of the city's most prominent gossip publication, exactly 36 hours after their dinner at Mama Benedetti's, under the headline, "Heiress and the Hero, Secret Romance Blooms After Dramatic Rescue." Isabella discovered it when her assistant Jennifer arrived at her downtown office, looking pale and carrying the morning papers with obvious reluctance. The image was surprisingly clear for a paparazzi shot. Isabella and Marcus walking through the park, his hand gently touching her face, both of them clearly smitten and completely unaware they were being watched. "Ma'am, I think you should see this before your father does," Jennifer said, placing the papers on Isabella's mahogany desk with the careful precision of someone handling explosives. Isabella's heart sank as she read the accompanying article, which managed to be both breathlessly romantic and subtly condescending. The writer painted their relationship as a modern fairy tale, while simultaneously emphasizing the vast gulf between their social positions. Marcus was described as a blue-collar knight in shining armor, while Isabella was portrayed as a lonely heiress seeking authentic connection outside her privileged bubble. The story wasn't malicious, but it was invasive in a way that made Isabella feel violated and protective of Marcus simultaneously. Their private moment, their careful first steps toward something meaningful, had been turned into entertainment for strangers who had no stake in their happiness or well-being. Her phone began ringing immediately, reporters seeking comments, friends calling with gossip and concern, and finally, inevitably, her father's secretary requesting her immediate presence in his office. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus was discovering the harsh reality of life in the public eye. He had been under the hood of a customer's car when his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, burst into the shop, waving a newspaper and wearing an expression of mixed excitement and concern. "Marcus, honey, you need to see this," she said, spreading the paper across his workbench. "You're famous." But as Marcus read the article, fame felt more like exposure than celebration. The story described him as hard-working and heroic, but also emphasized his modest circumstances in ways that felt patronizing. Phrases like humble mechanic and working-class hero seemed designed to emphasize his lower social status rather than celebrate his character or achievements. Within an hour, his shop was surrounded by reporters and photographers. Customers couldn't get through the crowd to drop off their vehicles. His phone rang constantly with interview requests and offers from talk shows. The simple, peaceful life he had built for himself was suddenly chaotic and overwhelming. The meeting between Isabella and her father took place in Richard Roswell's corner office, a space designed to intimidate with its floor-to-ceiling windows, museum-quality art, and furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Richard sat behind his massive desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict, while Isabella faced him from across an expanse of polished wood that felt like a battlefield. "This ends now," Richard said without preamble, sliding the newspaper across the desk toward his daughter. "Whatever adolescent rebellion you think you're engaging in, whatever point you're trying to make about class consciousness or social justice, it stops today." Isabella felt anger rise in her chest, hot and immediate. "This isn't rebellion, Dad. This is my life. Your life affects this entire family, Isabella. Your life affects our business, our reputation, our standing in the community. You cannot seriously believe that a relationship with a mechanic is appropriate for someone in your position." The disdain in her father's voice when he said mechanic made Isabella want to defend Marcus with a ferocity that surprised her. Marcus is a good man. He's honest, kind, and brave enough to risk his life for strangers. Those seem like exactly the qualities someone in my position should value. Richard's expression hardened. Those are admirable qualities in an employee or a casual acquaintance. They are not suitable qualities in a romantic partner for a Roswell. You have responsibilities, Isabella. Obligations to this family and to the legacy we've spent generations building. What about my obligation to myself? What about my right to be happy? Happiness is a luxury you can pursue after you've fulfilled your duties. Marriage for people like us isn't about personal satisfaction. It's about strategic alliance, shared values, and maintaining the social and economic structures that have given you every advantage you've ever enjoyed. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it was clear that no understanding would be reached. Richard saw Marcus as a threat to everything he had worked to build and protect. Isabella saw her father's attitude as everything that was wrong with their privileged world, the assumption that money made them better than other people, that class distinctions were more important than character, that love was less valuable than social status. When Isabella finally left her father's office, she felt both devastated and determined. The man she was falling in love with was being portrayed as either a gold digger or a novelty, while she was being treated like a wayward child who needed to be brought back into line. The unfairness of it all made her want to fight harder rather than retreat. That evening, both Isabella and Marcus faced the same difficult question. Was what they had found together strong enough to withstand the pressure of public scrutiny, family disapproval, and social expectations? Could their connection survive in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart? Marcus sat in his small apartment above the shop, listening to the chaos outside his window and wondering if pursuing Isabella had been the most selfish decision of his life. He had dragged her into a spotlight that neither of them wanted, created problems for her with her family, and turned their private feelings into public entertainment. Isabella sat in her childhood bedroom, looking out at the manicured gardens of the family estate and feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. The walls that had once represented security now felt like prison bars, and the world beyond those walls, Marcus's world, seemed both closer and more distant than ever. Both wondered the same thing. Was love enough to overcome the forces that seemed determined to keep them apart? Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, and new tests of their resolve. But tonight, despite everything, both held onto the memory of that perfect evening when the rest of the world had disappeared and only their connection had mattered. 2 weeks after the newspaper story broke, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He temporarily closed Rivera Auto Repair and drove to the Roswell family estate for a confrontation that had been building since the day their relationship became public property. The media attention had been relentless and intrusive. Reporters camped outside his shop, customers stayed away to avoid the circus, and his quiet life had become a fishbowl of speculation and judgment. But worse than all of that was the gradual realization that his relationship with Isabella was causing her real pain and family turmoil that threatened everything she had worked to build. They had managed to see each other only twice since the story broke, both meetings conducted in secrecy and overshadowed by the stress of constant surveillance. Isabella looked tired and strained, caught between her feelings for Marcus and the intense pressure from her family to end their relationship. During their last conversation, she had mentioned that her father was threatening to remove her from her position at the family company if she continued seeing Marcus. The Roswell estate was everything Marcus had expected and more. A sprawling mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured grounds with a circular driveway lined by ancient oak trees and a fountain that probably cost more than his annual income. As he parked his truck next to the marble steps leading to the front entrance, Marcus felt the full weight of the class differences that separated him from Isabella. Richard Roswell answered the door himself, a power move designed to emphasize that Marcus wasn't important enough to merit the attention of household staff. He was an imposing man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of wealth and influence. "Mr. Rivera," Richard said, his tone carefully neutral, "this is unexpected. Mr. Roswell, I'd like to speak with you about Isabella, about our relationship." Richard's expression remained unchanged, but he stepped aside to allow Marcus into the foyer. The interior of the house was as intimidating as Marcus had feared: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that belonged in museums. Everything spoke of money, power, and a lifestyle so far removed from his own that it might as well have existed on another planet. They settled in Richard's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. Richard took his seat behind the desk, while Marcus sat in a chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent, feeling like a defendant facing a hostile judge. "Mr. Rivera, I'll be direct with you because I believe you're a decent man who's gotten in over his head," Richard began. "My daughter is infatuated with you because you represent something novel and exciting in her otherwise predictable life. But infatuation isn't love, and novelty wears off quickly." Marcus had prepared for this conversation, but hearing Isabella's feelings dismissed so casually made his jaw tighten with controlled anger. "With respect, sir, I think Isabella is capable of understanding her own feelings. Isabella has lived a sheltered life. She's never had to worry about money, never had to make truly difficult choices, never had to consider the practical realities that govern most people's lives. She sees your relationship as romantic and authentic because she's never experienced what it actually means to struggle financially or to be excluded from the social circles that have defined her entire existence." Richard leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. But you have experienced those things, Mr. Rivera. You understand what it means to worry about paying bills, to work with your hands for modest wages, to be excluded from opportunities because of your background. Do you really want to subject Isabella to that kind of life? Do you want to take her away from everything she's known and drag her down to your level? The words hit Marcus like physical blows, not because they were cruel, though they were, but because they contained just enough truth to be genuinely painful. He and Isabella did come from different worlds, and loving her would mean asking her to give up privileges and opportunities that she had never lived without. I love her, Marcus said simply, and I believe she loves me. Love, Richard repeated, as if the word tasted bitter. Mr. Rivera, I loved my wife deeply when we married, but our marriage worked because we shared the same background, the same values, the same understanding of what was expected from people in our position. Love without compatibility is just passion, and passion burns out quickly when faced with real-world pressures. Richard stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the immaculate grounds. I'm going to make you an offer, Mr. Rivera, a generous one. I'll pay you $500,000 to walk away from Isabella and never contact her again. That's enough money to expand your business, maybe buy a larger shop, set yourself up for a comfortable life. All you have to do is disappear from my daughter's life. The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus felt a combination of rage and hurt that someone would think his feelings could be bought, but he also couldn't ignore the staggering amount of money being offered. $500,000 was more than he would earn in 10 years of running his repair shop. You think my feelings for your daughter are for sale? Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. I think you're a practical man who understands that sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. Isabella will be hurt initially, but she'll recover. She'll find someone appropriate, marry within her social circle, and live the life she was meant to live. And you'll have the resources to build a better life for yourself. Marcus stood slowly, his decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. Mr. Roswell, I understand that you're trying to protect your daughter, but you don't know Isabella at all if you think money and social status are what make her happy. She's lonely in that world of yours. She's looking for something real, something authentic, something that isn't measured by bank accounts or bloodlines. He moved toward the door, then turned back to face Richard one last time. I won't take your money, and I won't walk away from Isabella unless she asks me to herself. What we have is real, and it's worth fighting for. As Marcus drove away from the estate, he felt both pride in his decision and deep concern about what it might cost Isabella. He had stood up for their relationship, but he knew that Richard Roswell was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. The real test of their love was just beginning. That evening, Isabella called Marcus with tears in her voice. Her father had given her an ultimatum: end the relationship with Marcus immediately or lose her position in the family business, her trust fund, and her place in the family itself. She was being forced to choose between love and everything else that had defined her life. I need time to think, she whispered into the phone. I need to figure out what I can live with and what I can't live without. Marcus understood, even as his heart broke a little. The fairy tale was colliding with harsh reality, and neither of them knew yet whether love would be enough to overcome the obstacles arrayed against them. 6 months later, Isabella Roswell stood in the modest backyard of Marcus Rivera's small house, wearing a simple white dress she had bought at a department store and holding a bouquet of wildflowers they had picked together that morning. The journey to this moment had been the most difficult and transformative period of both their lives. Isabella's decision to choose love over family approval had cost her everything her father had threatened to take away: her position at Roswell Industries, her trust fund, and her place in the social circle that had once defined her existence. For the first time in her life, Isabella had experienced what it meant to live without financial security, to worry about paying bills, to work for wages rather than managing inherited wealth. The transition had been painful, and occasionally terrifying, but it had also been liberating in ways she had never imagined possible. Isabella had found work as a teacher in an underprivileged elementary school, finally pursuing the calling she had abandoned years earlier under family pressure. The salary was modest compared to her previous lifestyle, but the satisfaction of making a real difference in children's lives was worth more than any trust fund. Marcus had worried constantly during those first few months that Isabella would regret her choice, that the reality of a simpler life would prove too difficult for someone raised in luxury. But Isabella had adapted with a resilience and grace that made him love her even more deeply. She learned to cook, to budget, to find joy in small pleasures that she had never noticed when money was unlimited. Their wedding was everything Isabella's society friends would have considered inadequate. No cathedral, no designer gown, no reception at an exclusive country club. Instead, they were married in the small garden behind Marcus's house, surrounded by the neighbors and friends who had become Isabella's new community. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on making the wedding cake, a lopsided but delicious creation that tasted better than any expensive confection Isabella had ever eaten. The ceremony was performed by Father Miguel from the local Catholic church, a kind man in his 60s who had known Marcus since childhood and who had watched Isabella's integration into the community with approval and affection. There were perhaps 30 people in attendance, Marcus's cousins and their families, neighbors from the block, regular customers from the repair shop, and Isabella's fellow teachers from the elementary school. Catherine Roswell sat in the back row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter pledge her life to the man who had saved her in more ways than one. Catherine had defied her husband's orders by attending the wedding, a decision that had created a permanent rift in her marriage, but that she knew was necessary. She couldn't abandon her daughter for following her heart, even if that choice had led Isabella away from the life Catherine had always envisioned for her. Richard Roswell's absence was felt but not dwelt upon. Isabella had sent him an invitation, knowing he wouldn't come, but hoping that someday he might understand that love and happiness couldn't be measured in dollars or social status. The pain of his rejection was real, but it was overshadowed by the joy of building something authentic with Marcus. As they exchanged vows they had written themselves, both Marcus and Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had faced public scrutiny, family disapproval, financial uncertainty, and social ostracism, but they had also discovered that their connection was strong enough to withstand any external pressure. "Isabella," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "6 months ago, I carried you out of a burning bus without knowing your name. Today, I promise to carry you through whatever challenges life brings us, to support your dreams, to celebrate your victories, and to love you with everything I have for as long as I live." Isabella's voice was clear and strong as she responded, "Marcus, you saved my life that day, but more than that, you showed me what it means to live authentically, to love without conditions, to find joy in simple things. I promise to build a life with you based on truth, kindness, and the understanding that real wealth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the connections we make with people we love." After the ceremony, the celebration continued with a potluck dinner in the community center, with music provided by Marcus's cousin's mariachi band and dancing that lasted until well past midnight. Isabella had never attended a wedding reception where she laughed so much, where the conversation was so genuine, where the joy felt so authentic and unforced. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a modest camping trip to a nearby state park rather than the European tour Isabella might once have taken, both felt the profound satisfaction that comes from choosing correctly when faced with impossible decisions. "Do you regret anything?" Marcus asked as they stood on the porch of their small house, looking out at the neighborhood that had become Isabella's new home. Isabella considered the question seriously, thinking about everything she had given up and everything she had gained. "I regret that my father can't see how happy we are," she said finally. "I regret that our choices created pain for people we love. But I don't regret choosing you, choosing us, choosing a life built on love rather than obligation." 3 years later, Isabella would give birth to their first child in the same community hospital where she had recovered from the bus accident. Richard Roswell would eventually attend his grandson's baptism, the first step toward a reconciliation that would be slow and tentative, but ultimately healing for everyone involved. Marcus's repair shop would grow into a small chain of community-focused businesses that provided both automotive services and job training for young people in the neighborhood. Isabella would become the principal of her elementary school, implementing programs that help children from disadvantaged backgrounds develop the confidence and skills they needed to succeed. But on their wedding night, as they lay together in their modest bedroom and listened to the sounds of their neighborhood settling into sleep around them, none of that future mattered as much as the simple truth that they had found each other, chosen each other, and built something beautiful together, despite every obstacle that had been placed in their path. Their love story had begun with flames and smoke, with a split-second decision to risk everything for a stranger. It had been tested by social pressure, family disapproval, and financial uncertainty. But it had endured because it was built on something stronger than passion or convenience. It was built on genuine respect, authentic connection, and the rare recognition that some people are worth changing your entire life to be with. As Isabella fell asleep in Marcus's arms, she thought about the girl she had been 6 months earlier, wealthy, isolated, and desperately seeking something real in a world of carefully constructed pretenses. The crash that had nearly killed her had actually been the beginning of her real life, the moment when everything that truly mattered became clear. Love, they had learned, wasn't about finding someone who fit into your existing world. It was about finding someone worth building a new world with, someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway, someone brave enough to choose connection over convenience and authentic feeling over social approval. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Not that they had overcome the obstacles in their path, but that they had discovered love was always worth fighting for, no matter what it cost, no matter who opposed it, no matter how impossible it seemed. Their story would be told for years in their neighborhood as proof that real love could triumph over any barrier, that courage and authenticity could overcome wealth and privilege, and that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. Marcus and Isabella Rivera had found their forever in each other, and that was worth more than all the money and social status in the world. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, leave a like so more people can discover this incredible journey of resilience. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. I love getting to know you.